Good morning, it's 10:15. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Suzanne Ryan, and I am a CCFM staff member, and I will be moderating your session today. I will be passing around an attendance sheet for you to sign, so if you need AIA credits, list your AIA number, please, and make sure that your email is legible for us. If you do not need AIA credits, we still need you to sign in. We will provide a certificate of attendance if you check the box on the sheet. Welcome to session COV2509, aligning the church's infinite mission with its finite resources. This session is 1 hour and is certified with AIA for one learning unit. We prefer that you hold your questions to the end to ensure that our speaker can cover all of the required material. And please remember to complete the evaluation form on your desk, on your table before you leave. And there is a backside, and I will collect it right up at that front table. So our speaker today is William McCarthy, CRE. Bill is familiar with CCFM and has presented for us before. He has a long history of service to the Catholic Church and comes to us today with Counselors of Real Estate. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being with us today. It's like church, everybody's sitting at the back, no worries. I'm a Canadian, so I was up late last night watching our very convoluted election results, so we'll see how that goes. But anything that happens geopolitically is an impact on a church, so always have to bake that into the equation. As mentioned, I've been here before. It's always with a great honor. I'm a member of the Counselors of Real Estate, and I hope that you take some time to learn a little bit about us. We have this document here that you can take home with you, and you can Google us online. But the Counselors of Real Estate, we're about 1,000 worldwide. And what we do is high-level real estate counseling and consulting for our clients. We're also very altruistic. We do a lot of pro bono work. We have what we call the consultor corps. And what they do is they can be engaged at a modest fee, and you'll have 5 or 6 of the world's best real estate minds come in and look at your real estate problem or challenge. I've done a lot of those, 5 of them at least for Catholic and other ecclesiastic bodies. And we're honest brokers, very, very high-level thinking. And we all need assistance in the world ahead because it's a very challenging world, unlike any I've ever seen. Again, you can read up about the CRE and the Consulting Corps. Today's learning objectives are very simple. When I set up the title, Infinite Mission, that's our church, isn't it? Finite resources, that's our reality. And in my career, I've done about 3,500 files for various church groups, about 2/3 Catholic. But in my business, I do a lot of pro bono for other religious denominations, primarily because they might be a tenant, a colleague, or some other connection. And that is about 40 different religious denominations I've done. I've done everything from liquidating an entire diocese to setting up a strategic plan for the disposition or acquisition of real estate to actually doing a operational review, because right now we're in an era where we have to make hard decisions. If there's one big takeaway from this meeting, you have a hard job. You are managing and being responsible for assets in an increasingly challenging world, increasingly secular world. And that brings a lot of challenges and the opportunities. You have to work hard for them. So please keep that in mind as we go forward. I served 4 consecutive years or terms, that's 20 years on the RCA, Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Vancouver Finance Council. That's a canon law appointment. How did I get that appointment? I was selected by my Archbishop to serve on a committee assessing the school system in my home archdiocese. And our conclusion was we had to shrink it. Big. Data does not lie. Trends do not lie. And for that, he called me in and he says, well, we're not going to shrink it. In fact, I want you to help save it. And I want to appoint you on the Finance Council. And I was naive and I said yes. And it became probably one of the most important, but certainly most time-consuming and mental-consuming part of my career, because when you're thinking with the church, you're thinking temporal and you're thinking spiritual, and you have to always remember that. In my 20 years on that finance council and the years before and the years since, I always say this, and this might be a lesson for yourselves as well. I'm just as proud of the things I stopped as the things that I green-lighted and that we got built and approved. Because there will always be schemes and proposals put before you. People covet our real estate because we have a lot of it. Some dioceses are structured to withstand that, others aren't. So keep that in mind. You're the professionals in your diocese, so you have to really be forthright with your bishop and your ecclesiastic committees and appointments. Very important. Again, Catholic real estate is different because we have the civil law and the criminal law and all the laws of your land and your jurisdiction. That's everything from the zoning bylaws, land use from your civic level up to your state level to your national level. But we also have something called canon law. How many of you are familiar with canon law? Yeah, good, excellent. Because that's the temporal and the spiritual. The reason we need to know both temporal and spiritual law and management practices is because, again, the church's mission, it says that right in canon law, is perpetual. Pretty bold. That's very, very definite. But we here and our resources are finite unless we steward them. Stewardship is very important, and the patrimony. If you don't have a copy of that, you should have that in your office. That's our code of canon law. And it's very, very important to go through that in context of your roles as real estate and facility professionals and experts. I was given a copy by every bishop I served. There's been a few nuances, not significant changes since this edition came out. But there are references in this book to everything that impacts our real estate. So when we are looking at something from a real estate perspective, there should be a cross-reference. And certainly when you present or you discuss with the leadership of your archdiocese or diocese, they will have very specific questions. And they'll always want to keep going. And they'll often cite canon law. But we, as the real estate experts, have to be able to say, well, with regards to canon law, code, whatever, because it'll be in there, we have to be prudent with our patrimony, and we have to make hard decisions. If there's one word that I've used more than any over my long career working and serving and doing pro bono for ecclesiastic organizations, it's this, the word triage. We all know the word, or the series MASH, and triage meant, the wounded would come in and they'd quickly say, yay, nay, yay, nay. That's what it's going to be like in real estate with the Catholic Church and other religious organizations. And I think more so going forward, because we don't have the manpower, we don't have the commitment, we don't have the collection, we don't have the bingo, we don't have a lot of things that we once took for granted. In my archdiocese, virtually every one of the schools was built on the backs of bingo collection. And they were built cheaply. And the plan was, we'll have a capital campaign and we'll rebuild this. Well, when you see a 70-year-old building that is Band-Aid together and there's no bingo and the collection plate is not what it used to be, that is a challenge, right? It's no different than if you were in the private sector or public sector. Who are you serving? What is your stabilized cash flow? What is the commitment of that cash flow? The same applies for the church. And that's hard sometimes to get through the ecclesiastic component of your archdiocese, because they don't want to be the one to close. They don't want to be the one to not approve this program. They're the ones with the perpetual needs in terms of human needs and human demands, but they'll look at you and they'll say, how can we make this happen? And we'll say, well, our cash flow is stabilized based upon this level. For us to take it that level, unlikely. Well, then they'll go, what can we do? Can we sell something? And most of your dioceses are going to have some liquid assets. You're going to have investments. But most importantly, it's the real estate. It's always the real estate. one of the real interesting periods of my career for the Archdiocese is when we are looking at doing some strategic planning, and you know there's the files and the secret files, you know those concepts, but just looking about how my Archdiocese and other dioceses looked at how they grew their real estate patrimony and how on occasion, bit by bit, they lost it, right? So whenever I look at a site, I say to myself, okay, if this is a growing asset or community, I want to make sure that I have land buffering it. I want to make sure I have room for expansion. If I look at a property, it breaks your heart. Sometimes you go to see a site and you say, boy, if we only owned that, and you'll be told by the person from the parish, well, we used to. So that's a killer, but you have to be aware of that, right? Again, stewardship. And with regards to decision making, you all have heard this. Why did you do this? Well, it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And that kind of handcuffs us, because a lot of the files I've worked on before are saying, boy, if we had been engaged earlier or if we had made some tough decisions, we would have lived to fight another day. You have to know your diocese and you have to know your capabilities. Now, I break every rule with regards to PowerPoint. I throw too much stuff on there. I speak too much to them. But keep in mind that these PowerPoints are available to you. Also, what I've done is this document here. It's the buy, hold, sell strategy paper that I worked on with other counselors, but primarily my work. And basically, this is a template for how to assess your real estate and to make those critical buy, hold, sell decisions. This is available. CCFM has these, both the PowerPoint and this document. And if you can't get a hold of that for them, let me know and I'll email you one. So, please pick up on what I've learned over the years and then blend it into your own knowledge. I'm a big believer in benchmarking and best practices, and by sharing ideas and sharing thoughts. I think that's great. And I very much am a case study guy. Maybe one of my favorite things is to sit around with people like yourself and other experts or people who are actually on the front line, and you say, tell us your success stories. You learn a lot there. But tell us the horror stories. That's when you really go to town. So again, we don't want to make the same mistakes. There's one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. We should benefit from the wisdom that we have here, over there, and back and forth. Okay, you've all seen these before, hey? This is basically your hierarchical structure of the church, and you can see the reference to the canon law. Now that in itself is quite intimidating, because in addition to navigating through this, I also have to navigate, if I'm doing real estate advice, with the civic governments, with all the bureaucrats, the regional, the state, possibly the national, environmental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of meetings, lots of parties, lots of people in authority, lots of people with line item. If you look at the second level, you've got College of Consultors. You all know about them, picked by the bishop. You have your Vicar General, and there's the Diocesan Finance Council, where I served in Vancouver for 20 years. That's a canon law appointment, and if any of you have ever served on those, you take a confidentiality oath, and it is quite a significant responsibility. And when I took the oath for the first time, it kind of hit me. I said, ooh, this is quite serious, right? But with all those positions comes responsibility. Now, for me as a professional administrator and manager, someone who builds and develops his own real estate and consults for third parties, I always want to know who the decision maker is, what the process for the decision making is, and I'm always wary of the human element. If you look at this chart, we may be looking at 100 people filling these various positions, maybe more. And then that's not even taking it down to the parish level. So can you imagine how hard you have to work to basically work on any facilities or any real estate project or any plan, especially if that plan is contentious? The big issue over the last 25 years really has been, what are we going to be closing? So how tough is that, right? But it's the human element. And the church is supposed to be very hierarchical, very protocol-driven, canon law, et cetera, et cetera. It's not uncommon for you to go step, 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 and then at the last moment the bishop says no, or the consultants say no. And you say, okay, well, we're going to miss this boat. It's consequential. And so it's like the snowball down the hill, right? So you have to be a little bit political in terms of knowing the people, knowing your brief, knowing your file. But what I've always found, just take my jacket off, is that if you know the people involved, right, and you do your homework, they'll listen to you. Because, you know, I've not met people who are smart who don't want smart people helping them. It's easier said than done, right? But again, someone's got to do the work. We've all been in the meetings where there's a shortcoming or a shortfall, or things are not tracking the way that some thought it might work out, and somebody will say, well, let's pray a little harder. Nothing wrong with that, but sometimes the answer to your prayer is due diligence and hard work and making hard decisions, right? If you're not prepared to make hard decisions or hard recommendations, this is a very lonely job to be in, where you guys are. And I never give advice I'm not prepared to take myself, but again, that's doing your work. But if you look at that, in the course of your careers with your diocese, people will come and go off of these various bodies, and you're going to be dealing with multiples of people, right? Continuity and stability is very, very important to do things properly with regards to real estate and portfolios and decision makings. But our church isn't necessarily structured that way, okay? Be realistic about that. And of course, this plain speaking, I thought would wind my career down before it started, but 4 consecutive appointments to Finance Council because there was a recognition that, you know, there has to be tough decisions, and somebody sometimes has to lead those. Okay. Down below in the red, know, prioritize, and act. You have to know your real estate. You have to know your diocese. That's a real deep dive because you have to have so much information. Have any of you gone into your, no, I don't have to put up your hand because I think your dioceses are listed here, but I've gone into diocese, another church organization, not just Catholic, and I said, where's your real estate files? or where's your blueprints? Oh, we don't have blueprints. Oh, did you put them, are they electronic now? No, we don't have them. When we think they're in the basement of so-and-so and whatever, and, you know, could I see your files? When I go in and do an assessment or when I do a consulting project, my rule of thumb is this. I want to see everything. I'll decide whether or not it's relevant. And if I'm engaged, please do not make any decisions from the time I'm engaged until we discuss about whether or not I'll still keep working on the files and or a decision is made. But again, records are important. And you can ask yourself this, I won't ask for a show of hands, but do you think your real estate portfolio and your data bank and a good central place to put a blueprint out on a table or have your files and have your insurance policies and all your building codes and all your compliances, are you satisfied with how they are? You know, and I've never once seen a diocese which is pristine. I've seen a lot of good ones, but if I go back to when I first started talking to this group and before, sometimes it was, you know, well, why would we do that? Nobody else does it. Well, it's called being professional, right? And so that's something you should really push. You know, I'm very nervous about the future of tax exemption and about highest and best use and land valuations. You need to know what your real estate is capable of and what the expansion is. And that means if we go back to the temporal and the spiritual, what do the zoning bylaws say, right? Like you may have a parish landlocked in the center of so-and-so, but the OCP, Official Community Plan, has changed so dramatically that that property might be orphaned, might not be able to be a highest and best use in its current state. Its sale and or leasing, buy, hold, sell, might be impacted by what has happened, right? And again, when you're looking at real estate, you have to do that triage, but it's also a little bit like a chessboard, right? How are you mapping these things out? You know, you can Google church closing, school closing, financial drains, lawsuits, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite interesting to see the trends. I was Googling Cincinnati because we're just across the river there. And the Bishop Emeritus, I was reading all the files about basically closing and or consolidating about 70% of the church properties. Now I'm trying to figure out and learn a little bit more how far they went with that, but that was 200 church properties to be consolidated. That could be a trend, right? And so if you're going to do that, say you had 3 parishes and one is, you can operate one. How do you make that decision? And are you choosing the right real estate? Are you choosing the right path forward? Because, there's no certainties with regards to this. And what's the other big dynamic resource we need in terms of our infrastructure and our facilities? I think this is sometimes lost, and that's the human element. What is your capacity and what is the likelihood that you'll have enough priests and religious to operate the parishes? If our priests are aging, are we getting enough candidates in the seminaries? What's our replacement like? When I look at files historically, there was a time where every one of our schools had teaching orders in them. Built up a little bit of a false economy because we didn't really pay them, right? And then as we went secular, all of a sudden you have tens of millions of dollars in benefits and wages. Same thing with our hospitals. We used to always have the nursing and the healthcare. We closed 2 hospitals in our archdiocese, kind of scandalous how we did them, but that was because the sisters who were operating them were declining and aging, and they were more concerned, as they should be, about their retirement and their health and well-being. And just I wasn't satisfied with how a couple of those transactions went through, because the church should have had the opportunity to do something with those sites. I was able to get one of those sites back, the other was gone. But that's a tragedy. But again, how many priests do you have? Do you think a priest likes to go like a ping pong ball back and forth, back and forth? One thing when you serve in the archdiocese, study the religious order numbers. What's your priest like? Where are the priests coming from? Same thing with the religious. When I was a child, we used to send priests from my diocese around the world on missions. Now, thank God, we have Vietnamese priests from Goa, India, Southeast Asia, the Philippines. So it's gone full circle. But again, that is a resource you have to study, and that is your religious order and priest capacity. Sometimes that is an argument that helps you win a bit of a day, and that is, we used to have 300 priests. Now we're down to 180. That tells me that the trend line has to be absorbing that reality, right? Same thing with closing churches. A church that might get 25 people on a Sunday, the moment you say you're going to close it, everybody who was ever baptized there, buried there, married there, comes out of the woodwork and says, no. And then you say, well, what if we have a capital campaign because we've got to raise X amount of money just to keep the doors open, and everybody starts looking at their shoes, right? So we Catholics have to be a lot more realistic. And again, praying gets us to point A. After that, a little bit of hard work is required. I often talk in presentations, doesn't have to be just for the Catholic organizations, but about wants versus needs, okay? In all organizations, in all communities, in all governments, with all political decision-making, people have their wants. I want this, I'd like this, for whatever reason. But it's very important that you separate what is a core need, right? What is the need? If you can do a need and then add a want, that's good. But increasingly, you're going to have to make a decision about what can you realistically hold. Now, parishes used to grow where our model up in Vancouver, and I don't know about yours, but they used to build the church hall first. And you could celebrate Mass in there, and it would be a meeting place, maybe run school in the basement or whatever, then a church, and then the school. Well, you may be only able to do one of those things. And so the priority in my case would be we have to build a church. If you have anything else that flows from that, fine. But again, then you'll have various, if you look at your parish, look at your individual parish structure, finance council, you've got the parish council, you've got the education committee, you've got this committee, that committee. They all want something, right? How do you say no? Because ultimately, the priest may say, well, I'll have the finance council of my parish look at that, and maybe the real estate people, but then it's going to filter to you. And then you're going to say, well, you're the seventh parish in that deacon that wants the same things, but we just can't manage that. So priority wants have to follow essential needs, okay? And that's just hard decision making. And how do you win the day on that? You just be prepared. Numbers do not lie, right? That's the thing. When I go and I do a consulting assignment, it doesn't matter if it's a church or anything, but if I can't get hard data, verifiable data, and I'll never take data without verifying myself, I'm suspicious. You want to keep the school running. Okay, give me the enrollment statistics and the trends, and I want to know who's paying full freight or not or whatever. Oh, yeah, and 2 or 3 months later you don't get those? What does that tell you, right? And we had an off year on our collection plate. Well, show me the last 5 or 6 years, right? You've had an off decade possibly, right? So, numbers don't lie. In the Archdiocese of Vancouver, when we look at a church site, we calculated that in any geographic area, about 20% of the Catholics, 20% of the population might be Catholic. And when it grew from that, we would then start possibly trying to acquire that site for a church. We might even have feelers out beforehand. But demographics in my regions changed so much. A lot of immigration, a lot of different religions. And of course in Canada, what's the biggest religion checked on the census box? No religion, right? So what happens if you've done all these careful decades of planning, but the numbers and the demographics just don't make up? I grew up in Canada, obviously born and raised there. At the time of my birth, we were well over 60% Catholic coast to coast. Now we're about half of that, and again on the census, no religion always trumps, right? So keep that in mind. Those are numbers, those are statistics. And that should help you also in terms of doing your assessment of properties. If you've got finite resources, you almost have to make the case for others, because you're the experts, on what we can or can't do. You see in the red there, I think everybody has to realistically and objectively, not subjectively, ask that question. And is my diocesan base, and that's everything from the real estate to the number of congregants, to those attending Mass, to the collection plate, to this, to that, are you in decline? Are you stable? And or are you growing? And you can model this fairly simply and then a little bit more complex afterwards. But that's always been a very important thing for myself too, because trend lines usually are not like that. They're usually over time, right? And it's not uncommon that if you were to ask a diocesan official, they're very reluctant to say, oh, we're declining or we're past the point of no return. They'll always give you a good spin, which they should. But then I'll say, what's the plan forward to do that, right? And again, that's hard data. And you should be able to work with and engage and have expenditures to get the professional papers and studies that you need, right? Again, think about that database. Do you have current appraisals? Do you have current environmental? Do you have traffic studies? Do you have population growth trends and all this stuff? You should have a budget that allows you to get the information, the independent third-party information that you need to make your decisions. Now, you can all go online. You can pull the tax assessments and statements for all your properties, just to give you an idea on the land and also in terms of the facilities. But a facilities audit, a real estate audit, appraisals, that's black and white, right? Same thing if you're building. Does everybody know the cost to build in your diocese, the cost of a meter of pipe, a cost of how much does it cost for us to plan a church, to build a church, to outfit a church. So there's so much information, right? So much information. Always I start with a SWOT. We're all familiar with a SWOT. I don't think I've ever done a real estate project in my life for myself, for a third party, for the church, for any community organization where you don't do a SWOT. Why do I like SWOTs? Because they're simple to understand. You know, you get your piece of paper, you do your 4 boxes. But again, who's doing the assessment, right? Who is doing the assessment? Is it independent and is it objective? Okay? If a group wants to build a school or wants to retain a school and they were doing a SWOT, they would say the number one threat is closing the school, right? If you were trying to stabilize the asset base and the cash flow, you'd be saying the number one threat is operating a school that does not bring in sufficient cash and enrollment's down, and we are spending money at the expense of the balance of the mission. So again, whoever does it, but this is a very good point of departure. And simply, if I was to talk to one of you on an assignment or whatever and over a cup of coffee, I would probably internally, or maybe, you know, I'd say let's do a quick SWOT analysis, because that's telling me how realistic you are too as well, right? You know, I'm a glass half full guy, still am, harder to be one as you get older, but I also want to know where the other half went, right? So the SWOT analysis has always been the key in terms of a quick analysis about where do we stand at a given point of time. And the thing about it is you have to look at this with the here and now, but factor in the long term as well. You see where it says avoid emotion? I've been in too many organizational meetings with people from a parish, the school, the hospital, doesn't matter if it's Catholic or non or community, where something very dear to them might be lost. And all they want to do is preserve it because of the memories and history. But you might have to tell them, look, for us to live to fight another day, we have to make hard decisions. And nothing happens overnight. The data will give you the trend lines, right? All of this is also tied to communication, because I can't overstate that if your diocese does not have a communication plan, you are not doing your congregants right. The ecclesiastical leadership are not being explained properly, and your decisions are not being held up to fair scrutiny, but because this is a plan. So often when it comes time, for example, to close a parish or church, and it's usually a cluster, you know, they'll do a communication plan, they'll have meetings, they're not often very friendly. And then there might be a recast about this, but there has to be a reason. And simply for my case, what I've always wound up doing is saying words to the effect that we can have some very good parishes, some good ancillary, be it a school, maybe a retreat or whatever, but always within a rational point. Hard to say, hard to tell people, but if they look at you and they say, well, this person is professional, they know what they're doing, and if you can get them past that first emotion, you'll have an opportunity to expand on that. But again, I don't think, how many of you ever thought when you took your positions that it'd be easy? You know, we do a lot of things for the love of our church, right? I found one of the most important things is standing up for the church's infinite mission, and that means finite decisions in our time. What I'm very pleased over the years with CCFM is that there's an organization like this, right? Again, you've got a network and you've got shared values, shared goals, a lot of resources, right? So that's very, very important. Okay. Everything dictates and turns on cash flow, doesn't it? And if I was to say one of the most important things to look forward to is what happens to our Catholic Church and its massive real estate holdings and its massive capital and operational outlays every year if our cash flow is diminished, compromised, or reduced. Right now, you know, in your country, and we'll see what happens in mine, but a lot of these NGOs or funding programs, what happens when that cash flow is gone or gone now? You know, do they turn to the mother church and say, help us, you know? The person who might have been here before me, Hugh Kelly, counselor, excellent guy, he's doing an academic paper on the consequences of the migrant immigration. It's going to be quite interesting because he'll wind up finding out, you know, the cost drivers on that, and they're big, okay? So how does the church get money? Well, it's pretty much there, right? So if you were to think about your own, you guys probably look at the balance sheet probably more than the finance officer to see what's available, but are you in a good position? You know, good can mean holding your own in this world, right? We know the number of attendees is down. We know collection plates vary. When the appeal goes out for more money, somebody always winds up giving more. But there's a finite pool of donations, I find. Planned giving is very important, and more so than ever. So I hope that your diocese have planned giving for testimony, wills, and gifts, because that, in any organization, that's the wave of the future. But you need capital, you need reserves. There's going to be standards about how much you have to hold in reserves. So again, it's finite. You're only one lawsuit, and I never go too deep in this, away from losing that liquidity or your reserves, or what happens when it's time for a payment, a big payment. It's always the real estate, right? So know your cash flow and use this effectively to prioritize your own facility work, right? Again, if you look at it, triage, we have this much cash flow, try to stabilize it, try to annualize it so you know that you have it coming in, aim for that, and then try these other means by fundraising, estates, gifts, endowments, but always try to be cognizant of you have to have reserves, you have to have liquidity, and you also need annual operating income. And one thing that is, if you're on a finance council or your facilities, you are embedded into the finances of your diocese. You have to know those in explicit detail. And ideally, you have a pretty good relationship with your finance people as well, too. They have a tough job, too, because that pie can only be cut so many ways, and they're always being asked to cut a piece. Again, real estate always comes down to real estate. Not just our Catholic Church, every organization. If I was to go into any community organization hundreds of times, when I ask what they own or what they have, almost inevitably most of their asset is going to be tied up to a piece of real estate or a real estate portfolio. Might be performing, might not be performing, right? Might be a valuable piece of property, might not be a valuable piece of property. So it's that stewardship of the real estate which is the key. And so I mentioned previously, I think there's about 60 or 70 pages to buy, hold strategy for Catholic churches. But really, those three things are what you're doing. Catholic real estate, portfolio management, strategic planning, facility management can always come down to just these three decisions. Are you buying, are you holding, or you're selling? And don't use the middle one, hold, as a hedge against making a decision. You hold for a reason, because ultimately you're going to buy or sell. I have no problem with people selling an asset to buy a better asset. Governments are doing that all the time. A civic government I was just working on, I helped them with their strategic land portfolio, and that is, here's your portfolio. And governments, as you know, they're the only ones with more land and assets than the church, if you look at it in a jurisdiction. But this one jurisdiction I was working on had 350 properties that they thought could be put into a strategic pool, and then through a very careful metric, sell some of those to buy more strategic property based upon the city's growth pattern. Very simple, but very important, right? And that is, as city grows, just like a church population, you'll know where you're needed. You have to be very smart and very on top of your game to be able to do your buy, hold, sell. And I always encourage dioceses, when I go in and I look at them and say, how much money have you budgeted for your facilities management and your real estate people and all this stuff? And the number always shocks me. I said, you're kidding. Empower these people. They're the ones making the decisions. Give them the assets and the data and the team and the ability to go out and on a selective basis, engage a consultant or an expert so that they can advise you and the diocese properly. You know, again, that's not where you cut corners. This would just show you a basic real estate and property and facilities organization in a diocese. It's shown there just to show you that there's a lot of components there. Do you guys have project manager, construction managers, risk managers within your departments, or do you contract those out? Risk management is critical, right? That ties in with all your insurance. You cannot avoid risk, right? You can mitigate and manage it, but you cannot avoid it. So keep that in mind. But again, depending on the scope of size, I've been in some dioceses where they have a really good structured real estate department. Makes sense? I've been to others where, boy, if that one person I'm talking to gets hit by a bus, that's the end of their real estate and their facilities department, right? So keep that in mind. And don't be afraid to promote yourself and your abilities and what you can do. And with that regard, you know, every diocese should be a member of CCFM, and they should send you guys here. And they should pay for professional development. I'm pretty sure you like what I'm saying, but that's how I treat it. Like, I'm investing in an asset, right? And I want you to be the top. If I'd hired any one of you, that's because you're good. But how can we make you better, right? And how do we say to you, we acknowledge and we appreciate your intellect and your wisdom and your guidance, and we just want to keep you happy and your team, you know, going forward. The cost you invest in terms of looking after your real estate portfolio and your facilities is so small compared to the benefits. And also, conversely, if you don't have a good team, what are the consequences, right? You can't unring the bell. If decisions were made poorly, you never recover. It's like when I'm driving down the freeway, if I miss that turnoff, now I got to double back, and sometimes, yeah, forget it, I didn't need that burger anyway, or whatever. You just keep going, and you've missed that opportunity. One thing that has to be factored in here, again, I ask people to try to think of their real estate also like you would if you were working for the private sector or yourself. And that is, make decisions that are tested, right? And that's the key. Like, your name's going to be on it. I always tell people, you know, your counterparts, I can go into a file room and I say, wow, this person really knew what they were doing. And then I can look at this and say, what was that all about? Or, somebody wanted a real estate commission, right? So be careful of that. Okay. Again, if you look at that structure, finance council is very important. You're going to have a buildings commission and all that. But for your responsibility, look for talent, okay? Here's the concept of triage again. Again, what do you own? What do you control? What do you need? Are you growing? Are you stable? Are you declining? You look at every one of those assets, and it's not too much of a burden to say, you should know every piece of real estate in your portfolio, even if it's a big diocese or archdiocese, and even if you only have a cursory knowledge of it, but it's important, right? Because real estate, again, it's almost like we have to play chess now with our real estate moves, not checkers. We don't have the resources, and we do not have the pull we once did, because we're increasingly in a secular world, certainly the case in Canada. So again, triage. Hard to say because, again, you think of that opening scene from MASH, right? And if you ever read actual histories of medics in war, wow, there you be. Okay. You have to serve your diocese needs today, tomorrow, but into the future. If the church is perpetual, how do you manage an asset pool and your facilities to be here forever? And being here forever means you're going to make some tactical decisions to buy, hold, sell, right? But again, this is the key. You have responsibility to say when it's time to divest in a property or to possibly buy a property or to consolidate or to think outside the box. That's a lot of pressure. But you are in positions because I'm sure we're Catholics, partly providence, partly ability, partly need, partly somebody saying in you they need your talent, right? A lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility. But again, the decisions you make today will impact tomorrow and well beyond. You know, if you went to the church today, that Mother of God church, how beautiful was that church? You know, we'll never see churches like that again, right? Or you can go to Europe and you can see a cathedral that's 1,200 years old. Wow, those are perpetual. So our era, we have to do things a little bit different, trying to preserve a church like that. But again, where are the needs? What are the pressing needs? Again, that's pretty obvious. See, that's a beautiful church. That's a beautiful school. United States being a little bit older, you've got so many beautiful churches. You know, that Mother of God church, that would be a cathedral up in Vancouver. Gorgeous. But what happens when those beautiful churches can't make the dollars and cents work? Tough, hey? You know, if we ever decommission a property, that's very painful. There's a very canonical process to that. But again, I don't like to let anything go unless the time dictates it. And anytime anything is released, I always want to be able to say, and here's what we did with those resources. When you get in a situation when you're selling real estate to pay the bills today, or the annual bills, then you're in trouble. And I think you all realize that, right? So it says right there, what dictates the temporal or the spiritual agenda? Well, I'm sure like yourselves, myself, you've gone in and you've sat in front of the bishop and the College of Consultors and all that, and you were given a green light to do all this skookum real estate work and saying this is the plan. Here's where we think we have to disinvest to reinvest. And they may say, no, we're not going to close anything. Or what happens is you do all the work for one bishop, and then he's reassigned and a new bishop comes in. First thing the new bishop will say, I got to get my head around the diocese first, we'll look at it later, right? And then that means all the people that want to stop you closing something have another bishop to go to, right? So it's tough, but that goes with the territory. Again, buy, hold, sell. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this, but, you know, simply put is you're buying now strategically, okay? You're holding when you're determining whether or not that property can be strategic or it assists and buffers an existing property, right? And you sell when the property is past its life expectancy, it's redundant, or it can't be sustained, right? So, again, the PowerPoint will be made available to you, but it's very simple when you look at it, and that is, again, have all that data, do all the studying, and we're real estate people, so you always walk the land, right? I walk the land. I want to go see what's beside the church or the school property, or what's the growth area, where's the pattern, all this sort of stuff. Oh boy, this is all gentrifying. This property could be sold for a high rise, and we can use that to solidify another property. But you got to walk the property, right? I've never ever made a decision on real estate unless I physically have been on that site. Now, I'll study the property beforehand. I love aerials, I love appraisals, I love all the consulting reports. I love reading the zoning, I love highest and best use. I want to read the real estate transaction reports, but I want to physically go on the property. Okay, buy, hold, traps. Again, pretty self-explanatory, and I'm sure you've come across these. But the key is, I use the word amateurs. Be polite but firm, right? If you're going to a parish that's in trouble and the well-meaning board or the parish council says, no, you can't do this, that, and the other thing, well, why? Because it's nice or whatever. The bottom one there about the Catholic Church or schools, schools are a particular challenge because they're aging. Up in Canada, in Vancouver, we have a Category 1 Catholic, and that is we're supposed to have our church, our school be for Category 1, which are mass attending Catholic students and families. How do you prove that, right? You know, and numbers often in the schools don't align. Up in Canada and Vancouver, the government pays 50% of the student fee. The parent or the guardian family pays the other half. Used to be we used to have to pay 100%. We have to pay 100% of the capital cost. I believe in the States it's 100% out of the pocket of the family. Is that correct? So that's a determining factor as well, too. Who pays and what are you getting? And again, if in our case we have 50% funded by the government, the Archbishop will not take 51% or 60% because then you lose the Catholicity of the school. At 50-50, you're still struggling, right? Same thing with hospitals. Our hospitals are funded by the government. So you can either be Catholic or not. And that's going to be an issue up in Canada. Oops. Again, this is just to help you with your buy, hold, sell decisions. You'll find that if you work through a process, the decision whether to buy, hold, or sell becomes a lot clearer, right? That's why you have processes. That's why you have protocols. That's why you have the canon law. They're there to help you, okay? They're there to help you so that you're making a decision that is structured based upon best practices, based upon stable real estate fundamentals. And I can't say the word fundamentals enough. First time I said it today, but fundamentals are just that. There is a way things are supposed to work. But again, if you look down there, it says infrastructure analysis or inventory. What are your capabilities and capacities? Those are other terms I use quite a bit when I consult. Capabilities, what talent do you have? What numbers and supporting information do you have? And secondly, what are your capacities to execute that? Again, the temporal and the spiritual. Very difficult to balance both of them, but it must be done. You have to work through the temporal, then through the spiritual, then you get to your buy, hold. And you've got that temporal combined with the spiritual, when the world that you normally would work in would be just the temporal. And that's the key thing that we do that's different. We have two laws that govern us. Again, everything that we're doing is for the infinite. Canon law, the church's mission is perpetual. And then you'll say, well, yeah, try to align that with my diocese finances. Well, that's where your expertise comes in. Again, you have to be skill-focused, experience-driven, network, benchmark best practices. A lot of hard work, but I'm comforted that what I've seen over the past many years is an increased professionalism within our diocese, and you're an exhibit of that, so good on you on that. Oops. That's my presentation, so thank you. If I look at my watch, I think there's 5 minutes for a question, or if anybody has a question. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the archdiocese, for example,
Yep. Yeah, that's an easy question. Well, I make sure that whatever information you're using on whatever the SWOT analysis, whatever the real estate appraisals evaluation, try to update them as best you can. Could be just simply the tax statement of assessment. Always try to negotiate with lenders, because one thing about lenders or people trying to foreclose on church property, they don't like the PR about that. They don't like to be the one that's closing something. Okay. So what you're going to have to do then is, I think, just triage. If you look at your mission plan for the church, what is the right size for the diocese, and what would be the priorities to safeguard that? And then basically what I would do, from 1 to whatever number, 1 being the first to sell, how would you bundle these? Sometimes it could be a bundle, or it could be an individual property. And do your own analysis of the property from a buyer's perspective or a seller's. Is this tangible? Is this junk? Is this good real estate? Can this be liquidized? Is it in a development area? What the potential are? But it's just going to come down to a time, I think, where you're going to have to prioritize what assets are going to be sold, because it looks like stuff will be sold. And that's normally what I've done in the past. In previous times for other religious denominations, I once went through 67 churches, and I ranked them, and I said, and this was with a person I knew, a colleague, who was the lay chancellor of this diocese for the other denomination. And we ranked from 1 to 67, meaning 67 is the last you sell, which was the cathedral. But our list actually flowed pretty good, because there are some very obvious ones. You know, a small little property in a residential area that has no mass or no service attendance and all this. You're going to have to sell. What do you sell without impacting the overall mission? Any other questions? Yeah. So who owns, or how do you control the property? What do you do? Yeah, actually, I sometimes go a little bit deeper than that, but just because the church has 100 properties doesn't mean the diocese or the bishop controls 100 properties. You know, the subsidiary means that the parish might own that property. So the first thing that you have to do is, when you look at your list of properties, determine who the owner is. Is it controlled and owned by the bishop's sole corporate, or is it the parish? Because quite often that will be a make or break, and it's not uncommon for a parish to oppose a diocesan plan because, well, we own the property, it's in the name of ours. Now, the bishop is supposed to have control and power, but on the legal title, that dictates a lot. And so I think it's important to, and all of you should know, that what is controlled by the diocese directly and what is a parish. And that means more work and more strategic planning trying to align those, because sometimes the parish will be reluctant to follow the diocesan's lead if it's a liquidation or if it's a consolidation and buy wholesale. So that's very important to know the title. And canon law dictates all that, right? Again, I think if you had asked 100% of the lay audience and about 80% of the Catholic audience, they'd think everything is owned by the church or the bishop. That's not the case, so know that. And that might help you too when you look at the properties, like, you know, what is the diocesan control? Because that is easier when it comes time to sell. What's the straighter path? If I have to get all these approvals and Rome involved, indults, votums, all that, I'm sure you've worked on those. It can be quite interesting, quite challenging. I think, yeah.